from the legend of the three companions. Date 1246, probably. 13th century manuscript attributed to three of the companions of St. Francis, his brothers, as he referred to them. Brothers Angelo, Rufino, and Leo. The legend means more or less a story, or a chronological story as opposed to just a collection of anecdotes. So this is not a legend about the three companions. This is the legend of St. Francis as told by the three companions, much like we say the Gospel of Luke, but it's not about Luke. One day, as Francis was riding near Assisi, he met a leper. He had always felt an overpowering horror of these sufferers. But making a great effort, he conquered his aversion, dismounted, and in giving the leper a coin, kissed his hand. The leper then gave him the kiss of peace, after which Francis remounted his horse and rode on his way. Some days later, he took a large sum of money to the leper hospital, and gathering all the inmates together, he gave them alms, kissing each of their hands. Formerly, he could neither touch or even look at lepers. But when he left them on that day, what had been so repugnant to him had really and truly been turned into something pleasant. His previous aversion to them had been so strong that besides being incapable of looking at them, he would not even approach the places where they lived. If by chance he happened to pass anywhere near their dwellings or to see one of the lepers, even though he was moved to give them alms through some intermediate person, he would nevertheless turn his face away and hold his nose. But strengthened by God's grace, he was enabled to obey the command and to love what he had hated. The consequence of this, he became such a friend to the lepers that, as he himself declared in his testament, he lived with them and served them with loving eagerness. Here ends the reading. Unlike Jesus, Francis left a number of documents of his own writing in his own hand. There are the rules for his order, of which there are various versions. There is correspondence, there are liturgies and prayers. There is a little handwritten blessing that he wrote for his brother Leo. There is the beautiful song, the Canticle of Creation, from which we refer to Brother Sun and Sister Moon. But in all these writings from Francis' own hand, really the only autobiographical detail about his personal spiritual journey. It's at the beginning of a document called the Testament, which is mostly rules for his brothers with order. And it says simply this: the Lord gave me Brother Francis to begin doing penance in this way. When I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. And so the Lord himself led me among them. And I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness, soul and body. Afterwards I delayed little and left the world he had known. That's all. There's not much detail there. So we have to rely on his companions for this longer her story. Elsewhere in his Old Testament, he says, he does say, God, by grace, made me stronger than I was. And which could mean stronger than I was before, or like stronger than I actually was. God, by grace, made me stronger than I actually was. In that moment when he met the leper on the road. Now, leprosy in the biblical context and leprosy in medieval Italy were probably not exactly the same thing. Leprosy, as it refers to, is referred to in the Bible, is sort of a catch-all for various diseases that would affect the skin, some contagious, some not, some temporary, some not. Leprosy in medieval Italy referred to the disease that we would now refer to as leprosy. It was debilitating and disfiguring. It caused sores and ulcers. It caused the deforming of fingers and noses and ears and eyes. It was, moreover, contagious, and everyone knew that. This was the disease, and these were the people that Francis felt such horror and revulsion toward. But the people of Assisi were also devout in their following of the example of Jesus. And so there was this sense that Francis and his neighbors had that these were folks who ought to be treated humanely and provided for, just not too close by. So Assisi's up on the hill. Down below in the valley there were several leper houses or leper colonies, leprosariums, as they were called, like a sanitarium. It was a place of banishment, but it was also a place of safety, where they were given shelter, they lived in community, they would have a church built for them, and someone would come and minister to them. They begged for alms, but they did receive them. My travels last month to Assisi, I visited the site of one of these leprosariums, but the only thing remaining, it's all developed now, there's roads and highways and things, the only thing remaining is the church, which is not big, but it is made of stone. There was an actual village there. But it is one thing to follow the example of Christ in showing alms and giving alms and care to one who has suffered, and it is another thing to follow the example of Christ in loving them. I was in pondering this story, I had a phrase come into my mind, and I realized it was from a news story from a few years back. The phrase was, "No one wants to see that." Like, no one wants to see that. It was a news story from 2019, when a combat veteran from Afghanistan, Luis Avila, who had been grievously wounded. He had lost a leg, he had had 2 strokes, he was left with brain injury. And he was invited to sing God Bless America at a welcoming ceremony for the Commander-in-Chief. And he struggled through it. It was obviously he had gone through a long rehabilitation to even be able to sing at all. And when the song was over, the president went forward and embraced him and thanked him. But as he walked away, he turned to the general beside him and said, "Why do you bring people like that here? No one wants to see that." Which, weirdly enough, means that I have just spotted that there is something in common between the president and St. Francis of Assisi. So maybe we need to let that sink in for a minute. was it that enabled Francis to get past that place where he was not just doing his duty as he had to do, doing the mandatory embrace with someone that he really didn't want to see. How did he come to love them? I don't really know the answer, but I have a thought. While I was in the CC, I became very aware that there were crucifixes everywhere. Not crosses, crucifixes, images of Christ on the cross. So not the shiny cross or the old rugged cross of the Protestant churches, but the form of a human being in torture, dying on a cross. And as good, liberal Presbyterian kids, I remember my sister and I used to be sort of appalled when we would see an actual crucifix. Because we felt like it was sort of creepy, it was kind of morbid, it was like kind of R-rated, so should children, we didn't want to look at that. And my sister may have even said at one point, no one wants to see that. But the more I walked on the footsteps of Francis and prayed in the same places as he said, as he prayed, and sat and just spent some time in contemplation, looking at the same figures that he looked at, I began wondering if perhaps, at least for Francis, the practice of gazing upon this figure in adoration had somehow prepared him to look upon others who were suffering with a gaze that was unflinching and loving. So that when he stopped and saw the man on the road, stopped and actually saw him, he recognized him. Because he bore a resemblance to someone that Francis loved. And so too, perhaps it is at times with us. We see a young man beaten in a hate crime and tied to a fence. When we see a prisoner naked, arms stretched out, that's a familiar figure. When we see a wounded veteran, or we see one who has been disfigured by disease, that's a familiar figure. In the Middle Ages, there were versions of the crucifix where Christ appeared with the signs of leprosy. In Northern Europe, there were ones where Christ appeared with visible signs of the plague. The artists knew what they were doing. We've all been tempted to avert our eyes from something that seems painful or strange. But perhaps, like Francis, when we look upon someone in need, we can see their resemblance to someone we love and respond to them with love. Even if, especially if, that person is the person we see in the mirror. You see, there is the example of Christ as one who showed pity on those who suffered. And then there is the example of Christ as one who also suffered. So that whichever side of that equation we may find ourselves on, we too may find that what had seemed a horror to us becomes the face of someone we love. May it be so. Amen.